Miss Marple and the body found in the bell tower at dawn. Chapter 1. The Discovery. The morning mist clung to the village of Ashford like a reluctant guest, refusing to depart despite the early sun's efforts to coax it away. St. Michael's Church stood sentinel over the sleeping hamlet, its Norman tower piercing the grey veil with the quiet authority of 6 centuries. It was this tower that had witnessed more than its share of village secrets, christenings, weddings, and funerals that marked the turning seasons of small lives lived closely together. Mrs. Eleanor Vane, the vicar's wife, had risen at 5:30, as she did every morning, her internal clock as reliable as the bells she could hear from her bedroom window. At 73, she had grown fond of these solitary hours before the village stirred, when she might tend to the church flowers and prepare the sanctuary for Sunday service. It was a habit born of 40 years of marriage to Reverend Clarence Vane, a good man whose faith was matched only by his ineffectiveness at managing the practical matters that kept a parish functioning. The bell tower door creaked as she pushed it open, her arms laden with fresh white lilies. The stone stairs spiraled upward in that familiar curve, and her footsteps echoed with the rhythm of decades of routine. She did not hurry. There was no need. The bells would not ring for another 3 hours, but as she reached the platform where the bells hung in their iron cradles, Eleanor Vane froze. The lilies nearly slipped from her grasp. A man lay sprawled across the dusty wooden floor, his body at an odd angle beneath the great bell itself. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, Eleanor's mind refused to process what her eyes were reporting. Then the reality crashed over her. With the force of the bell's morning peal, she screamed. The sound echoed through the tower and out across the still village. A cry of such genuine terror that it penetrated the closed windows and curtained bedrooms of 100 sleeping homes. By the time Eleanor had descended the stairs and alerted her bewildered husband, who was still in his dressing gown, fumbling for his spectacles, the news had already begun its inevitable journey through Ashford's collective consciousness. The body belonged to Mr. Desmond Harker. This fact, once confirmed by the constable from the next village and the doctor who arrived within 40 minutes, sent a peculiar shock through Ashford North, the shock of tragedy, which often accompanies unexpected death, but something more complicated. Harker had been a man of 62, a widower of 5 years, a retired solicitor who had moved to Ashford 3 years prior, when his wife had died. He was wealthy, unmarried, despite several rather transparent campaigns by village widows and their matchmaking daughters, and thoroughly disliked. By mid-morning, the small sitting room of the Ashford Hotel had become an informal gathering place for those not content to wait for official information. Miss Marple, who maintained rooms at the hotel during her frequent stays in the village, was seated in her favourite chintz chair by the window, her knitting needles clicking with mechanical steadiness as she worked on a pale blue cardigan. "Murdered, they're saying," Mrs. Constance Hartley whispered from her perch on the settee. She was the postmistress's wife, a woman who prided herself on being among the first to know everything. Struck on the head, quite deliberately. "I haven't heard that confirmed," Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard countered. She ran the village shop and was not about to let Mrs. Hartley have the last word on any matter. "Dr. Meadows hasn't said anything definitive. It could have been an accident." Miss Marple made a small, thoughtful sound. Not quite agreement, not quite dissent. Her pale blue eyes remained fixed on the garden beyond the window, where early roses were beginning to open despite the morning's chill. "Well, whatever it was, he's been found in the bell tower," said Miss Marple softly. "That's rather specific, isn't it?" Not a road accident, not a fall in his garden. Perhaps he was ringing the bells and fell, suggested young Robert Ashworth, the postmaster's son. He was 28 and worked in his father's office in town, coming home on weekends. His suggestion was meant to be helpful, though everyone in the room knew that Desmond Harker had never shown the slightest interest in bell ringing. In the dark, Mrs. Hartley said sharply, at what would have been past midnight, when the bells are never rung. Miss Vane found him at 5:30. Someone offered Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. Has anyone considered how Mr. Harker came to be in the bell tower at such an hour? He was not a man given to early rising, was he? And he certainly was not a man of religious inclination, judging by his attendance at services. The room fell quiet. This was true. Desmond Harker had attended church exactly twice in his 3 years at Ashford, once out of apparent obligation at Easter, and once, inexplicably, on a Wednesday evening in March, when few were present. Perhaps he couldn't sleep, Mrs. Pritchard ventured. Some men, at his age, get restless. But why the bell tower? Miss Marple's question was posed with such genuine curiosity that it seemed merely the musing of an elderly woman making conversation. Yet those who knew her even slightly recognized the quality of attention beneath the gentle inquiry. It's not as though he lived nearby. His house is on the far side of the village. He would have had to walk past several homes to reach the church. And why go into the bell tower itself? One might take a walk at an unusual hour, but to climb those stairs. Mrs. Hartley leaned forward. They say the door was locked from the outside. That's what I heard from Dr. Meadows' nurse, who heard it from the constable. This detail, delivered with the significance it deserved, silenced the room. A locked door changed everything. It suggested intention. It suggested that whoever had closed that door had intended to leave Mr. Desmond Harker where he lay. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again and resumed her work, but her eyes had taken on a particular stillness. Outside, the village of Ashford continued its Saturday morning routine, unaware that the careful social architecture it had constructed, built on habit, propriety, and the convenient fiction that everyone understood their place, had just begun to crumble in her quiet way. Miss Marple was already listening, already watching, already beginning to see the patterns that others would overlook, because in her long experience with human nature, she had learned that villages were very much like families, and in families, there were always secrets that someone was desperate enough to kill to keep. Chapter 2. The village reacts. By Saturday afternoon, Ashford had transformed into a village consumed by speculation. The police precentor, superintendent from the county, to constables, and Dr. Meadows conducting his preliminary examination had given the tragedy an official weight that quickened the pulse of gossip. The locked bell tower door became the detail everyone seized upon. The fact that made murder undeniable. Miss Marple observed the machinery of village reaction with the detachment of someone watching a familiar play performed by actors who believed their roles to be entirely novel. She sat on a bench near the church green, her knitting abandoned in her lap, watching the clusters of people form and reform like cells dividing under a microscope at 2 o'clock. The vicar's wife, Eleanor Vane, was still trembling noticeably. She sat in the rectory parlour, a cup of untouched tea before her, retelling her discovery to anyone who would listen. Miss Marple had called to pay her respects and found the room crowded with well-meaning callers. Eleanor looked diminished somehow, as though finding a body had stripped away some essential layer of composure that age and habit had constructed. His face was quite blue, Eleanor was saying to Mrs. Hartley, her voice wavering. I shall never forget it. And the position he was lying, as though he'd been struck down mid-thought. The bell itself didn't strike him. Then, this was a practical question from Mrs. Patricia Thornton, the doctor's wife, a woman known for her logical mind and her tendency to state uncomfortable truths. Dr. Meadows said no. Eleanor replied, the bells are not rung at night, and besides, the blow came from something else, something held in a hand. I think. Miss Marple sipped her tea and said nothing, but her eyes moved to Eleanor's hands, which twisted together in her lap with nervous energy. Guilt took many forms, she reflected. Sometimes it was the guilt of having discovered something one wished one hadn't. Sometimes it was something else entirely. Later, at the hotel, the speculation had reached fever pitch. The bar was crowded with village men, all with theories. It was the Ashworths, declared Frederick Graves, who owned one of the larger houses and considered himself an authority on village matters. Stands to reason. The old man was always making difficulties about property lines, always threatening legal action. The boy wanted to marry Sarah Ashworth, but the old man was standing in the way, or so people say. Robert Ashworth, present in the bar, flushed deep crimson. That's absolute rot, he protested. I barely knew Harker. And Sarah, he stopped, recognizing that his own vehemence was confirming the suspicion rather than denying it. Young love always stirs up trouble, said old Mr. Pemberton, who had lived in Ashford for 80 years and believed this. Observation granted him the authority to make pronouncements about anything. If the old man had money, there was always someone who wanted it, or resented him for having it. He had a nephew, someone offered. In London. Stands to inherit, I'd imagine. But the nephew wasn't here, countered Thomas Wickham, the blacksmith's son. He was in London. The police asked about that straight away. Easily arranged, Mrs. Hartley interjected. Having somehow made her way into the bar, which was technically not appropriate, but which no one would challenge. Hire someone. Pay them to do it. Miss Marple entering the bar ostensibly to request a cup of chamomile tea. Listened to this volley of accusations with serene patience. She settled into a corner chair, her knitting resumed, and let the theories wash over her like weather. The superintendent had released certain details. Desmond Harker had been struck on the back of the head, the blow forceful enough to suggest either great anger or considerable strength. The murder weapon had not been found. The time of death was estimated between midnight and 4 in the morning. The bell tower door, locked from the outside, suggested the killer knew the layout of the church. The key hung in the vestry, accessible to anyone who regularly attended services or who knew where to find it. By evening, Miss Marple had formed a picture of the village's collective suspicion, and it was revealing in its inconsistency. Everyone had a theory. Almost everyone had a suspect, and nearly everyone's theory revealed more about the theorist than about the likely killer. Frederick Graves, whose property borders touched Harker's land, suspected Robert Ashworth because property disputes had a way of becoming violence in Graves' world. Mrs. Hartley suspected the nephew because inheritance always motivated. Crime in the women's magazines she read religiously. Thomas Wickham, who had been openly mocked by Harker at the market for his work on a horse's shoe, suspected the butcher's son, against whom Harker had made some cutting remark about his family's lineage. Eleanor Vane, still trembling, seemed to suspect everyone and no one, her mind too disrupted to settle on coherent suspicion. And the Reverend Clarence Vane, in his awkward way, kept suggesting that perhaps Harker's own character flaws had somehow drawn violence to him, a theory that was both uncharitable and, Miss Marple reflected, not entirely without merit. As evening fell and the village gradually withdrew into its homes, Miss Marple sat in her hotel room, the cup of chamomile tea now cold beside her. She was not thinking about the obvious suspects. She was thinking about patterns. She was thinking about the fact that the bell tower door was locked from the outside. Was thinking about the specific moment in Eleanor Vane's retelling when the other woman had averted her eyes. She was thinking about the small, almost invisible connection between three apparently unrelated people in the village, and she was thinking, with the quiet certainty of long experience, that the village was looking in every direction except the right one, outside. Night had fallen completely, and somewhere in those shadows, someone was calculating what they had done and what came next. Someone was measuring their chances of escape against the weight of their guilt. Miss Marple set down her knitting and prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new revelations. Depending on one's perspective, the game, as it always was in small villages, had barely begun. Chapter 3. Early investigations. Sunday morning dawned grey and uncertain. The kind of English morning that seemed to hesitate between rain and reluctant sunshine. The church was fuller than usual, though whether this was due to genuine piety or morbid curiosity, the Reverend Vane could not have said. He conducted the service with his customary diffidence, his sermon hastily revised from something about the prodigal son, now addressing the mystery of divine providence and the sudden darkness that could envelop even the most peaceful communities. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, third from the front on the left, her hymnal held at precisely the correct angle. Her voice, when she sang, was thin but true. Her attention, however, was divided between the service and a careful observation of who was present and, more significantly, who was absent. The Ashworths were there. All of them, the postmaster, his wife, and their son Robert, who sat with visible tension in his shoulders. Sarah Ashworth, the daughter, was conspicuously absent till someone whispered, though Miss Marple had seen her that morning at the hotel, appearing perfectly healthy if somewhat withdrawn. Frederick Graves sat alone, his wife having remained in town. The Thorntons were present, Patricia with her particular air of calm competence. The butcher's son attended with his parents, looking thoroughly miserable. Eleanor Vane sat beside her husband, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that the knuckles showed white. But it was Thomas Wickham's absence that caught Miss Marple's attention. The blacksmith's son had been in the bar the previous evening, theorizing along with everyone else. Yet his pew was empty. After the service concluded, Miss Marple made her way to the vestry, where the superintendent was conducting preliminary interviews. The vicar had reluctantly granted him access to the bell tower and the immediate area, and the superintendent, a competent man named Harrington, perhaps 50, with the weary expression of someone who had seen too much of human nature, was methodically documenting everything. "Miss Marple," he said, acknowledging her entrance with courtesy. "Come to offer assistance, have you? I've heard rumors that you have some small experience with criminal matters." There was the faintest hint of amusement in his voice, but not unkindly. Miss Marple had encountered police superintendents before, and most of them eventually developed a healthy respect for elderly ladies who paid attention to details. "I merely came to view the bell tower," Miss Marple said gently. "If it's not an intrusion, I've been a parishioner here for many years, and I confess I'm curious about how such a thing could happen in our community." The superintendent gestured toward the spiral stairs. "The door was locked from the outside, as you've likely heard. The key is kept on a hook in this vestry see here, accessible to anyone who regularly attends services or has legitimate business in the church. Both vestry doors were unlocked when the vicar arrived this morning. No signs of forced entry. How many people would know to look for the key?" Miss Marple asked. "That's the question, isn't it?" Harrington replied. "The vicar says at least a dozen regular volunteers, flower arrangers, those who help prepare the church, though there are only 2 of those remaining, and both are well into their 70s. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And Mr. Harker himself? Did he ever come to the church except for those 2 occasions?" The vicar couldn't recall him doing so. Then how would he have known where the key was kept? The superintendent's expression shifted slightly, not quite satisfaction, but recognition. "Someone told him, presumably, or someone brought him here deliberately." It was as Miss Marple ascended the bell tower stairs that she noticed the first detail that seemed to escape the superintendent's attention. The steps were dusty. The tower was rarely cleaned, but there were marks in the dust suggesting 2 sets of footprints, not one. One set, smaller and more deliberate, came from below, but another set, larger and somewhat confused in its pattern, seemed to circle the landing as though the person had been pacing or waiting, or perhaps struggling against something. The body had been removed by then, but its location was marked with chalk. The superintendent had photographed everything methodically, but he had not, Miss Marple observed, noticed the small detail that she now studied with particular attention: a button, dark wool, lying beside the marked outline. It had clearly come loose from clothing. The thread still attached suggested recent separation. Superintendent Miss Marple called down the stairs. "You may wish to examine this more carefully." By afternoon, the superintendent's preliminary conclusions had begun to form. Desmond Harker had been struck on the back of the head by some blunt instrument, a hammer, perhaps, or a heavy piece of wood. The blow suggested either considerable anger or an attempt to eliminate a dangerous opponent. The locked door suggested premeditation. The button found at the scene was dark wool, consistent with the jacket Harker had been wearing. The question, the superintendent said to the small group he had assembled at the police station in the next village, is not who killed him, but who had the motive and the opportunity. The motive is easy. He was a wealthy man with few friends. The opportunity is harder. The church is visible from several houses. Someone would have noticed an unfamiliar presence. It was at this moment that the constable returned with information. Thomas Wickham had been arrested at the railway station, attempting to board a train to London with a suitcase packed and his savings withdrawn from the bank. The village, when it learned this news, felt the peculiar relief that comes with a suspect in custody. Here was resolution, explanation, closure. Thomas Wickham, the blacksmith's son, must have murdered Desmond Harker. Perhaps the old man had insulted him once too often. Perhaps there was some debt, some grudge, some hidden resentment that had finally exploded into violence. Miss Marple, reading the newspaper account Monday morning in the hotel sitting room, said nothing to anyone. But her pale blue eyes held a particular quality of thoughtfulness, and her knitting needles clicked with unusual speed, because she unlike the rest of Ashford, was not relieved. She was, in fact, more puzzled than ever. Chapter 4. First, suspects Thomas Wickham sat in the police holding cell with the bewildered expression of a man who had suddenly found himself in a nightmare from which he could not wake. He was 26 years old, the blacksmith's only son, a competent tradesman with calloused hands and a reputation for quiet reliability. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, and absolutely no sensible explanation for why he had been attempting to flee the village on Monday morning with his entire savings in cash. "I panicked," he kept saying, his voice hoarse with desperation. "I heard about the murder, and I panicked. I thought people would assume it was me because I'd made remarks about Harker. Angry remarks. He'd been cruel about my work, about my family. I lost my temper at the bar. Everyone heard me." The superintendent listened to this explanation with the patience of professional experience, but his expression was one of deep skepticism. Innocent men did not run. They did not withdraw their savings and attempt to board trains to London at dawn. They did not carry packed suitcases and guilty consciences. "Where were you Saturday night?" Harrington asked, his pencil poised over his notebook. "Between midnight and 4 in the morning. In my bed, at home. My mother will tell you, your mother will tell us whatever you've instructed her to say," the superintendent interrupted, not unkindly. "We need independent verification." "There isn't any," Thomas said miserably. "I live at home. My father was out. He goes to the public house some nights. My mother sleeps in the back bedroom. She wouldn't have heard me if I'd left." It was damning testimony, Miss Marple reflected when she learned of it through the inevitable village gossip network. A young man with opportunity, with motive, with a demonstrated loss of temper, and now with apparent flight. The superintendent was already preparing the case for the magistrate. The brown wool button found at the scene would almost certainly match Thomas Wickham's jacket. The murder weapon might yet be discovered. The case, in the superintendent's assessment, was straightforward. Yet Miss Marple, sitting in her hotel room on Tuesday afternoon, was reading through the newspaper accounts with a frown of concentration. There were several small inconsistencies that troubled her. The first was the simple fact of the locked door. If Thomas Wickham had struck Desmond Harker in a moment of rage, which was the superintendent's implicit theory, why would he have locked the door afterward? A crime of passion suggested immediate flight, not methodical tidying up. The second was the question of how Thomas Wickham, who lived on the opposite side of the village, knew that Desmond Harker would be in the bell tower at an unusual hour. Wickham was not a churchgoer. He would not have known about the key's location. He would not have had reason to believe Harker would be in such a place. The third was Eleanor Vane's behavior, which continued to trouble Miss Marple, more than seemed reasonable for a woman who had merely discovered a body. On Wednesday morning, Miss Marple took her customary walk through the village, ostensibly to purchase postage stamps and examine the new stock at the local shop. In reality, she was observing the subtle shifts in village dynamics that had occurred since Thomas Wickham's arrest. The Ashworths seemed visibly relieved. The cloud of suspicion that had hung over them had dissipated. Frederick Graves, encountering her at the post office, expressed his satisfaction that the matter was being handled decisively. The butcher's son, no longer the subject of speculation, had returned to his ordinary demeanour. But Eleanor Vane, when Miss Marple called on her at the rectory on the pretense of discussing flower arrangements for the church, seemed somehow more anxious rather than less. "It's a dreadful business," Eleanor said, pouring tea with hands that shook slightly. Poor Thomas Wickham, though I suppose he must be guilty. The evidence is quite compelling, is it? Miss Marple asked gently. I confess I'm not entirely convinced. The bell tower is such a specific location, and Thomas, by all accounts, is not a particularly clever young man. Would he have thought to lock the door? Would he have known about the key? Eleanor's hand trembled as she set down the teapot. The police seem satisfied. The police, Miss Marple replied, are satisfied because they have found a suspect who fits the most obvious pattern. But human nature, in my experience, is rarely as obvious as it appears. There was a long silence. Eleanor stared at her teacup as though it might contain some answer to a question she had not yet articulated. Do you believe Thomas is innocent? Eleanor asked finally. I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that there are aspects of this crime that remain unclear, and I believe that the truth, once revealed, may be considerably more complicated than simple rage and simple murder. After Miss Marple's departure, Eleanor Vane sat alone in the rectory parlour for nearly an hour. The tea grew cold in its pot. Her hands gradually stopped shaking, but her expression remained troubled, as though she were engaged in some internal struggle between competing loyalties and fears. That evening, Miss Marple received a visitor at the hotel. It was Robert Ashworth, the postmaster's son, and he appeared to have something urgent to communicate. Miss Marple, he said, entering her sitting room with visible agitation. I need to speak with someone, and I thought perhaps you might understand. Please sit, Miss Marple invited, gesturing to the chair opposite hers. You appear distressed. It's about Thomas Wickham, Robert said. About Saturday night. I haven't told the police this because I wasn't entirely sure it was relevant, and I didn't want to complicate matters, but now, with Thomas arrested, I feel I must tell someone. Then tell me, Miss Marple said quietly. I saw Thomas, Robert said, or at least, I believe I did. I was returning from visiting someone, late, around 1 in the morning, and I saw someone who resembled Thomas on the road near the church. But here's the peculiar thing. He was not alone. Someone was with him. Someone was practically dragging him along. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. Could you identify this other person? No, Robert said. It was too dark, and I was too surprised to look carefully. I kept moving, not wanting to draw attention. But Miss Marple, if Thomas was with someone else, then perhaps he's not. Perhaps the real killer is still. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. I rather think that's precisely the case. Chapter 5. A hidden clue. The brown wool button remained in an evidence envelope on Superintendent Harrington's desk, a small detail that seemed to corroborate the case against Thomas Wickham. Yet when Miss Marple requested with careful politeness and the particular persuasiveness that elderly ladies possessed to examine the jacket from which it had supposedly come, she noticed something that appeared to have escaped the superintendent's attention. Thomas Wickham's jacket, when produced from the evidence room, bore no empty buttonhole corresponding to the lost button. All its buttons were intact. Curious, Miss Marple murmured, holding the garment up to the light filtering through the police station window. A button from a jacket with all its buttons present. How do you account for that, Superintendent? Harrington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The button must have come from another jacket. There may be others in his home. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed without conviction. Though it seems rather precise, doesn't it? To find a button at the scene that matches a jacket he owns but is not missing from that particular garment. It was this conversation that prompted the superintendent to allow Miss Marple access to a small room where the evidence collected at the scene was catalogued and stored. Ostensibly, she was there to help verify details for the church. In reality, Harrington suspected that her observant eye might catch something his officers had overlooked. He could not have known that this was precisely what she intended. The bell tower itself had been released as a crime. Seen by Wednesday afternoon, the superintendent's investigation had moved into its second phase, gathering testimony, securing the statement Robert Ashworth had reluctantly provided, and attempting to determine who had been with Thomas Wickham on the night of the murder. But Miss Marple had asked specifically to examine the bell tower in daylight. With the superintendent's permission and without his immediate presence, she climbed the spiral stairs slowly, her hand on the iron rail, taking in the details of the space with methodical attention. The dust on the steps remained largely undisturbed. The landing where the body had been found was marked with chalk. The great bell hung above, a massive thing of bronze and iron, silent now but resonant with the weight of centuries. The smaller bell beside it was similarly imposing, its surface covered in the patina of age. It was near the smaller bell that Miss Marple found what she had been seeking, a length of dark fabric, torn and caught on the rough edge of the bell's iron mounting. It was approximately 4 inches long, and when Miss Marple carefully extracted it, using a handkerchief to preserve any evidence, she saw that it matched the colour and weave of the wool jacket that Thomas Wickham wore. But here was the peculiarity. The fabric was torn from the inside seam, not from the front where a button might be missing. Moreover, the tear suggested violent separation, a sleeve caught and wrenched away rather than a button simply coming loose. Miss Marple stood very still, turning this detail over in her mind like a key seeking a lock. If Thomas Wickham had been in the bell tower, his jacket had not come off through accident or simple struggle. Someone had grabbed him forcefully enough to tear his sleeve at the interior seam. Someone had held him with sufficient violence to leave this mark. This suggested that Thomas Wickham had not been the aggressor. It suggested, rather forcefully, that he had been restrained by Thursday morning. Miss Marple had presented her findings to the superintendent, who received them with the mixture of appreciation and irritation that men of logic often felt when confronted with the superior observational skills of elderly women. The torn fabric was tested against Thomas Wickham's jacket and confirmed to match. But the question remained, if the jacket had been torn by violent restraint, how had the button come to rest at the crime scene? The answer came from an entirely unexpected direction. It was Eleanor Vane who, in a moment of what appeared to be absent, asked Miss Marple to help her locate a button that had come loose from her own coat, a dark wool coat that she had worn to church on Sunday. The day after the murder, Miss Marple examined the coat with particular attention, noting that the button in question was indeed missing, and that it matched precisely the button found at the crime scene. When she gently pointed this out to Eleanor, the vicar's wife went very pale. "That's impossible," Eleanor said, though her voice suggested she knew it was not. "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied quietly, "it explains several things that have puzzled me. You were in the bell tower, weren't you? On Saturday night? You and Thomas Wickham." Eleanor sank into a chair, her composure finally shattering completely. "I wasn't." She stopped, unable to find words adequate to the situation. "Take your time," Miss Marple said, settling herself into the chair opposite with the patience of someone prepared for a lengthy conversation. "But I think you had better tell me everything, because unless I'm very much mistaken, you are protecting someone." and that protection is allowing an innocent man to be accused of murder. Eleanor's hands twisted together in her lap. The same nervous gesture Miss Marple had observed from the beginning. But now, looking at the woman more carefully, Miss Marple saw not guilt, but fear. And fear, in Miss Marple's long experience, pointed toward a victim rather than a perpetrator. "If I tell you," Eleanor whispered, "he'll know. And he's already promised that if I speak to anyone, he'll make certain that Thomas goes to trial. He says the evidence is sufficient. He says no one will believe me." "Who?" Miss Marple asked, though she was already beginning to suspect. "Who has made you this promise, Eleanor?" The answer, when it came, would overturn every assumption the village had made about the crime in the bell tower. It would reveal, in its terrible clarity, that the simplest explanation was sometimes the furthest from the truth. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secret Eleanor Vane's confession. When it finally came, emerged in fragmented pieces a narrative that had been locked behind fear and maternal instinct for nearly a week. Miss Marple listened without interruption, her knitting needles still, her pale blue eyes fixed on the woman before her with an expression of profound compassion. "Sarah," Eleanor began, her voice barely above a whisper, "my husband's niece. She came to stay with us 3 months ago. Her mother Clarence's sister, she's in poor health, and Sarah needed somewhere stable while she recovered from." Eleanor paused, gathering courage. "While she recovered from a very difficult situation." Miss Marple made a small sound of understanding, but said nothing, allowing Eleanor to continue at her own pace. "Desmond Harker," Eleanor said, the name emerging like poison from her lips. "He saw Sarah at church. He began to pay attention to her. At first, it seemed harmless, an old man's admiration for a young woman. But then it became something else. He began to call at the rectory. He made remarks. He touched her inappropriately when he thought no one was watching." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. "I told Clarence, but Clarence, he didn't quite believe me. He said I was being oversensitive, that Harker was merely old-fashioned in his manner. I told Sarah to avoid him, but Harker was persistent. He seemed to believe that his wealth, his position, his age gave him certain rights." "When did this escalate?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Saturday afternoon," Eleanor said. "Sarah had gone to the village to purchase supplies. Harker encountered her near the post office and made an explicit proposition. He told her that he would set her up in a cottage, provide her with money, that she should be grateful for the attention of a man of his standing. When Sarah refused and walked away, he followed her. He told her that he always got what he wanted, that her refusal was merely a game." Miss Marple's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "What happened then?" "Sarah came home deeply distressed. She told me everything, and I was furious, more furious than I've ever been in my life." Eleanor's voice trembled with the memory of that rage. "I told Clarence, and this time he believed me. We discussed what to do. We talked of going to the police, but Harker was a respected man, and Sirashi was afraid. Afraid of what he might say about her, of what he might claim." "So you decided to confront him," Miss Marple said, understanding now beginning to crystallize into coherent shape. "Not I," Eleanor said. "Clarence decided. My husband, Miss Marple. My quiet, diffident, ineffectual husband decided that he would speak to Harker directly, that he would make clear that such behavior would not be tolerated in his parish. He went to Harker's house that evening, but Harker was not there. The housekeeper said he'd gone out, that she didn't know when he'd return." Eleanor paused, her breathing shallow. Clarence came home disappointed, frustrated. He said he would try again on Sunday. But then, around midnight, Sarah came to us in tears. She said Harker had appeared at the rectory garden, trying to open the windows, calling for her. He was drunk. He was insistent. He said he knew she wanted him, that she was simply being coy. "My God," Miss Marple breathed. Clarence went out to confront him, Eleanor continued. They argued in the garden. Harker laughed at him. He said that a vicar's protests meant nothing, that he would do as he pleased. He said things about Sarah that were unspeakable. And then he said something about Clarence's own failings, his weakness, his inability to protect those under his roof. Eleanor's voice became almost mechanical, as though she were relating events that had happened to someone else entirely. Thomas Wickham was returning home. He lives not far from the rectory. He heard the commotion and came to investigate. Harker was still being abusive. Clarence, in his anger, demanded that Harker leave the premises immediately or he would call the police. But Harker didn't leave. Miss Marple said softly, "No." He laughed. He said that the vicar would do no such thing because scandal would destroy the parish more thoroughly than his actions could. He said he would return whenever he pleased, that Sarah would eventually come to understand her good fortune. And then he began walking toward the church, saying he needed to clear his head, that he would think on his situation and perhaps reconsider, though his tone suggested he meant nothing of the sort. Eleanor's hands were shaking visibly now. Thomas and Clarence followed him. Thomas was angry on Sarah's behalf. He said Harker should be ashamed, that such behavior was criminal. Harker merely laughed at him. When they reached the church, Harker said he would pray for guidance, though it were a jest, as though nothing about his behavior was wrong. He had the key to the bell tower, Miss Marple asked. He must have stolen it at some point, Eleanor said. Or perhaps he simply found the vestry door unlocked, as it often is. Clarence followed him up. Thomas followed Clarence. I came behind. Them I don't know why, exactly, except that I couldn't bear to be left alone, not knowing what was happening. Eleanor's voice became barely audible. When we reached the landing, Harker was standing near the great bell, laughing at Clarence, mocking him, saying that the vicar's prayers would do him no good because God, like everyone else, would understand that a man had the right to take what he wanted. And then Clarence, my gentle, pacifist husband, he saw a piece of iron lying on the landing, part of the bell's mounting that had come loose years ago, and she could not finish. But she did not need to. He struck Harker, Miss Marple said, completing the sentence with the certainty of long experience with human nature. In defense of Sarah, in protection of his parish and his household, Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her face. It was one blow. Harker fell, and we realized, all three of us, what had happened, what Clarence had done. Thomas wanted to call for help, wanted to fetch a doctor, but I saw that Harker was already gone. One moment of rage had changed everything. And the locked door, Miss Marple asked. Clarence locked it, Eleanor said. He thought that if it appeared to be an accident, if people thought Harker had come alone, that perhaps no one would be blamed. He took the key with him. Thomas's jacket caught on the bell as we were leaving. I tore it trying to free him. Eleanor looked directly at Miss Marple for the first time in her confession. When I found the body the next morning, I pretended shock. But I already knew. I've known since Saturday night. And I've been protecting my husband because he was protecting Sarah. Because one terrible moment of justified rage should not destroy everything he has built. Miss Marple sat in silence. For a long moment, her mind working through the implications of this revelation. The case was no longer simple. It had become what human cases so often became: complicated, sympathetic, and deeply troubling in its moral ambiguity. "Does your husband know you've told me?" Ms. Marple asked finally. "No," Eleanor whispered. "But he suspects. He knows I've been unraveling since the murder. He knows I can't bear having Thomas suffer for something he didn't do." "Then we must speak with him," Miss Marple said. Chapter 7. Another twist. The rectory parlour seemed to have shrunk somehow when Miss Marple, Eleanor, and Reverend Clarence Vane occupied it together on Thursday afternoon. The vicar sat in his preferred chair, his hands folded in his lap with the studied composure of a man who had been expecting this moment and had prepared himself as best he could. Yet his eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, held the haunted quality of someone who had spent days wrestling with conscience and law, duty and survival. "Eleanor has told you," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, settling herself with characteristic calm. "And I believe she has told me the truth. The question now is what must be done with that truth." Reverend Vane's laugh was hollow and without humour. "What can be done? I struck a man down in rage. Regardless of his behaviour towards Sarah, regardless of the circumstances, I committed murder. The law does not grant exceptions for justified anger, does it not?" Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Or rather, does the law not recognize degrees of culpability? There is a considerable difference between premeditated murder and a crime of passion committed in defense of another." "I locked the door afterward," the vicar said, his voice heavy with the weight of this detail. "I attempted deception. I allowed an innocent young man to be arrested. Those actions suggest premeditation, do they not? They suggest deliberation after the fact. They suggest," Miss Marple corrected gently, "panic and poor judgment in an extraordinary moment. But they do not suggest that you went to the bell tower intending to kill Desmond Harker." There was a long silence. Outside, the village of Ashford continued its ordinary Thursday, people tending to their gardens, children returning from school, the rhythm of small lives unaware of the drama occurring within the rectory walls. "There is something else," Eleanor said quietly. "Something that happened after Saturday night. Something that changes things further." Both Miss Marple and Reverend Vane turned to look at her. "Sarah," Eleanor continued, "has disappeared." The words hung in the air like a bell that had just been struck. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with immediate interest, while the vicar rose from his chair with visible alarm. "What do you mean, disappeared?" he demanded. "She was here Tuesday morning," Eleanor said. She knew, of course, that Thomas had been arrested. She seemed relieved, as though his arrest had taken some burden from her. "But that evening, I found a note in her room. She had taken what money she had and left. She wrote that she couldn't bear being the reason for all of this, that she was going away, that she would be safer gone." "Where would she go?" Miss Marple asked. "London, most likely," Eleanor said. "She has an aunt there, someone she mentioned once or twice, but I don't have an address. I've been searching her things, trying to find some clue to her whereabouts, but there's nothing." Reverend Vane sank back into his chair, his face ashen. "If she's left because of this sif, her absence becomes no nit. Will appear that I sent her away. It will look like I'm hiding her testimony. Destroying evidence, it will look," Miss Marple interrupted, "as though a traumatized young woman, distressed by the events surrounding her, chose to remove herself from a difficult situation, which, in fact, is the truth." But even as Miss Marple spoke, her mind was already working through the implications of this new complication. Sarah's departure was unfortunate, but perhaps not entirely surprising given what the girl had endured. Yet it raised a troubling question. Had Sarah left of her own volition, or had something or someone prompted her departure? Miss Marple rose from her chair. "I believe," she said, "that before we take any action regarding your confession, Reverend Vane, we must first locate Sarah, because her account of Harker's behavior, her testimony to his harassment and assault, is crucial to establishing the context of what occurred." "You mean to suggest," the vicar said slowly, "that you do not intend to immediately report what Eleanor has told you to the police?" "I intend," Miss Marple replied, "to fully understand the situation before any such action is taken. There are aspects of this matter that remain unclear to me, and I have learned, through considerable experience, that rushing to judgment often results in the obscuring of important truths." It was this resolution that prompted Miss Marple to conduct a methodical search through Sarah's abandoned room. The girl had been neat in her packing, leaving behind only items she did not value. But beneath the floorboard, under the bed, a hiding place so obvious that it suggested Sarah had not been. Thinking clearly when she hid it, Miss Marple found a packet of letters. They were from Desmond Harker. The first letters were almost courteous, of admiration for Sarah's grace and beauty, suggestions that he might assist in her future prospects, offers of tea and conversation. But as the sequence progressed, they became increasingly explicit in their intent and increasingly threatening in their tone. "I know you want to refuse me," one letter read, "but you will come to understand that refusal is merely a game that young women play. I have the resources and the patience to wait, and when you finally relent, as you will discover that I am not a man to be trifled with. There are ways of making people understand their obligations." Another, written on the day before his death, contains something even more chilling. "I have decided to accelerate matters. I will come to the rectory tomorrow evening. You will either agree to my proposal, or I will ensure that certain information regarding your past becomes public knowledge. Information that will make you completely unmarriageable in this village or any other. The choice, my dear, is entirely yours." Miss Marple sat on Sarah's narrow bed, the letters in her trembling hands, and understood suddenly that the situation was far more complicated than Eleanor's confession had suggested. Desmond Harker had not been merely a persistent nuisance or an inappropriate elderly man. He had been a predator operating with calculated intention and psychological manipulation, and Sarah, frightened and alone, had known exactly what he intended to do. It was this realization that prompted Miss Marple to ask Eleanor a question that, when answered, would introduce yet another layer to this increasingly complex crime. "Eleanor," she said quietly, "did Sarah know that Harker was dead before you told her? Did she know that her blackmailer, her threat, had been removed?" Eleanor's face went pale. "Ah, yes. Clarence told her Sunday morning." "Why do you ask?" "Because," Miss Marple said slowly, "I am beginning to wonder whether Sarah's departure was quite as innocent as we have assumed. And I am beginning to question whether the crime at the bell tower is quite as straightforward as even your confession has suggested." Outside, evening was falling over Ashford, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, the truth of what had actually occurred on that fatal Saturday night remained hidden, waiting to be discovered by an elder. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test. Miss Marple did not go to the police on Thursday evening. Instead, she spent the night in her hotel room. Harker's letters spread before her on the small writing desk. her mind working through the intricate patterns of human motivation and deception with the methodical precision of someone solving a particularly complex puzzle. By Friday morning, she had made a decision. She sent word to Reverend Vane that she wished to speak with him privately at the hotel, away from Eleanor's anxious presence and the rectory's oppressive atmosphere. The vicar arrived at 10 o'clock, looking considerably older than he had the previous day. The weight of his confession seemed to have settled upon his shoulders like a physical burden, bending him slightly forward as he entered the hotel's sitting room where Miss Marple waited. "I have read the letters," Miss Marple said without preamble, gesturing for him to sit. "The ones Sarah left behind. The correspondence from Mr. Harker." The vicar's face went rigid. "You searched her room?" "I did," Miss Marple confirmed, "and I found evidence of something that complicates your confession considerably." She rose and retrieved the letters from her bedroom, laying them before him in chronological order. The vicar read through them with growing horror, his hands shaking as he turned from one page to the next. "My God," he whispered. "I didn't know about these. Eleanor Sarah must not have told us everything. Harker was blackmailing her. He knew something about her past." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "and that knowledge gave him considerable leverage over a frightened young woman. Now, Reverend Vane, I have a question, and I require that you answer it with complete honesty, because what you tell me now will determine what action I take. Regarding your confession," the vicar looked at her with the expression of a condemned man awaiting sentence. "When you went to the Bell Tower on Saturday night," Miss Marple continued, "when you followed Desmond Harker up those stairs, were you alone in your intention to confront him? Or did someone else, someone with perhaps even greater motivation than you, possess to accompany you with a different purpose in mind?" There was a terrible silence. The vicar's jaw worked as though he were attempting to form words that would not come. "Answer me," Miss Marple said gently, but with absolute firmness. "Was Sarah in the bell tower?" The vicar's face crumbled. "Yes," he whispered. "God forgive me, yes. She followed us. She said she needed to tell Harker herself that she would never submit to his demands, that she didn't care what he threatened to reveal. She was angry, so angry but also terrified. She wanted to face him, to assert some control over the situation." Miss Marple sat very still, her pale blue eyes fixed on the vicar with an expression of profound understanding. "And when Harker began his taunting, when he laughed at your objections and continued his threat toward Sarah, what did she do?" "She picked up the iron," the vicar said, his voice barely audible. "She stood beside me, and she picked up the same piece that I had been holding, and when Harker turned away from me in his arrogance, he could not continue. She struck him," Miss Marple said quietly. "Not you. Sarah struck the blow that killed Desmond Harker." "I locked the door," the vicar said, the words tumbling out now in a desperate rush. "I took the responsibility. I told her that I would claim it was my doing, that she was to say nothing, that I would protect her. She was in shock. She didn't resist when I told her to go home, to tell no one, to act as though nothing had happened. And you allowed Thomas Wickham to be arrested for your wife's protection of her traumatized niece," Miss Marple said, her tone carrying the weight of moral judgment without descending into condemnation. "You permitted an innocent young man to face trial for a crime committed by a girl acting in the grip of terror and desperation. What else could I do?" the vicar demanded, his voice breaking. "Sarah has suffered enough. Harker had been tormenting her for weeks. He had threatened to ruin her. And in that moment, she was defending herself, defending her dignity, her future, her very self. Was I to sacrifice her to the law? Was I to allow her to be destroyed by the legal system for defending herself against a predator? That, Miss Marple said, is a question for your conscience and for the law. But it is not a question I am qualified to answer for you. She rose and moved to the window, looking out over the village of Ashford with the expression of someone who had seen too much of human nature to maintain illusions about its goodness. Your wife discovered the body. She understood what had occurred. She protected Sarah by her silence, and she protected you by covering your absence from the rectory. She has been suffering profoundly since then, not from guilt, but from the knowledge that an innocent man was being blamed for a crime committed by a traumatized girl she had failed to protect adequately. I couldn't let Sarah be prosecuted, the vicar said. She had done nothing wrong. Harker was assaulting her. Harker was committing a crime, Miss Marple interrupted. But Sarah's response, while understandable, was also a crime. And the law does not exempt us from its judgments simply because our actions are sympathetic. The law exists precisely to prevent us from taking justice into our own hands, however justified we believe our actions to be. The vicar sat in stunned silence, his carefully constructed narrative of self-sacrifice collapsing around him. What will you do? He asked finally. I will tell the police the truth, Miss Marple said. Thomas Wickham will be released, as he should have been from the beginning. Sarah must be found and brought back to answer for what occurred. And you, Reverend Vane, must decide whether you will continue to protect her through deception, or whether you will finally allow her to face the consequences of her actions, consequences that, given her age, her circumstances, and the provocation she suffered, may be considerably less severe than you fear. The village, the vicar said hollowly. The parish will be destroyed. My reputation will be damaged. Certainly, Miss Marple agreed. But reputation is a fragile thing, and it often survives better through honest acknowledgement of failure than through the perpetuation of lies. And your parish, well, a parish that cannot survive the revelation that its vicar is human, that he can make terrible mistakes, that he can prioritize protection of a vulnerable girl over obedience to loss. Shutter Parish was never truly strong to begin with. She turned from the window and looked at him directly. You have one opportunity to do the right thing, Reverend Vane. You can contact the police yourself, tell them the truth, and demonstrate through action that you understand the gravity of what has occurred. Or you can allow Miss Marple, an elderly woman in a small village, to be the one who exposes what you have tried so desperately to hide. The choice remains yours, but choose quickly. Because the truth, in my experience, always emerges eventually. It is only a matter of timing. Chapter 9. The reveal. Superintendent Harrington received the vicar's confession on Friday afternoon, delivered in person by a man who appeared to have aged a decade overnight. The superintendent listened with the patience of professional experience, his expression shifting from skepticism to understanding as the full narrative emerged. By the time Reverend Vane finished speaking, the superintendent had already begun mentally reconstructing the case not as a simple crime of passion, but as a complex tragedy involving 3 vulnerable people and 1 predatory man. We'll need to locate the girl, Harrington said, his tone carrying neither judgment nor approval. Sarah Vane, correct? And we'll need her account of what occurred. She's likely in London, the vicar said. She has an aunt there. I can provide the name if I can find it among Eleanor's papers. We'll manage, the superintendent replied. He paused, studying the vicar with an expression of complicated sympathy. "What you've done, allowing an innocent young man to be arrested, that will be difficult to forgive. But I suspect you already know that." "I do," the vicar said quietly. By early evening, Thomas Wickham had been released from police custody. The young man emerged from the station with the dazed expression of someone who had been caught in a nightmare from which he was only now awakening. His parents received him with tears and recriminations, and the news of his exoneration began to spread through Ashford with remarkable speed. Yet the villagers' relief at his innocence was quickly tempered by confusion, and then by scandal. When the true nature of events became known, it began, as such things often do in small villages, with whispered conversations in shops and at garden gates. By Saturday morning, the full story had become public knowledge, though in the manner of village gossip. It had been reshaped and reinterpreted to suit the particular biases of each teller. Some said that Sarah had been a willing participant in Harker's advances and had murdered him when he refused to marry her. Others suggested that Reverend Vane, overcome with rage at Harker's behavior, had struck him down and then allowed his innocent niece to believe she was responsible, a final act of patriarchal protection. Still others whispered that Eleanor had orchestrated the entire affair, that she had deliberately brought Harker and Sarah together to create an opportunity for murder. The truth, which was considerably more complicated and considerably more tragic than any of these interpretations, was largely lost in the swirling currents of speculation and moral judgment. Miss Marple sat in the hotel sitting room on Saturday afternoon, reading the afternoon newspaper's account of the scandal with the detached observation of someone who had witnessed the transformation of truth into gossip many times before. The article was sensationalized, the facts were distorted, and the actual moral complexity of the situation was reduced to simple accusations and counter-accusations. It was Eleanor Vane who sought her out that evening. The vicar's wife appeared diminished somehow, as though the relief of having her secret exposed had paradoxically made her smaller rather than larger. She sat across from Miss Marple with the posture of someone who had been carrying an enormous weight and had finally, thankfully, set it down. "The police have found Sarah," Eleanor said. "She's in London, staying with her aunt. They're bringing her back tomorrow. She'll be questioned formally, and then the magistrate will decide what happens next." "How is she?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Frightened," Eleanor said. "Angry. She feels betrayed that we revealed what happened, though I tried to explain that we had no choice, that allowing Thomas to be blamed was impossible." Eleanor's hands twisted together in the familiar gesture of anxiety. "She's also insisting that she acted alone, that Clarence had nothing to do with it. She's trying to protect him." "Of course she is," Miss Marple said. "She is young, traumatized, and she believes that by claiming sole responsibility, she can somehow save the people she loves. This is the logic of guilt and desperation, not the logic of truth." "Will she be prosecuted?" Eleanor asked. "That will depend on many factors," Miss Marple replied. "Her age, her state of mind at the time, the evidence of Harker's harassment and threats. The law, despite its apparent rigidity, has more flexibility than people often realize when circumstances are properly presented." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "I have been thinking about what you said about how reputation often survives better through honest acknowledgement of failure than through perpetuation of lies. I'm not certain I believe that yet, but I'm beginning to understand why you might say it." "It is not a belief that requires immediate acceptance," Miss Marple said kindly. "Some truths take time to settle into understanding. By Sunday morning, the village of Ashford had experienced something of a collective shift. Sarah's returner, pale, frightened girl, escorted by police officers, had prompted a re-evaluation of the narrative. The letters from Desmond Harker had been made public, and their explicit threats and predatory language had forced even the most judgmental members of the community to acknowledge that this was not a simple case of youthful passion or criminal malice. The church service that morning was crowded beyond capacity. People came not for worship but for the chance to observe the players in this village tragedy, to see how Reverend Vane would conduct himself, whether Eleanor would appear at all, whether Sarah would be present. Only Reverend Vane and Eleanor attended, sitting in the front pew with the visible courage of people facing community judgment with dignity. Sarah remained at the rectory, preparing for her formal questioning by the magistrate's court. As the service concluded, Miss Marple observed something that she suspected few others noticed. The moment when old Mrs. Pemberton, the village's eldest resident and least merciful judge of human failings, approached Eleanor after the service and took her hand briefly. No words were exchanged, but the gesture carried a weight of recognition, one woman acknowledging the impossible choices another woman had faced. This, Miss Marple reflected, was how villagers slowly healed from scandal, not through forgetting, but through the gradual acknowledgement that human beings were complicated, that choices were rarely simple, that sympathy and judgment could coexist without negating one another. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a final visitor, Superintendent Harrington, come to inform her of the developments in the case. The girl's solicitor is arguing for leniency, the superintendent said, arguing that her actions constituted self-defense against a man who had made explicit threats against her. It's an unusual argument, and it may not succeed entirely, but it has merit. And what is your assessment? Miss Marple asked. My assessment, Harrington said slowly, is that a young woman acted to protect herself against predatory behavior, that she made a terrible mistake in doing so with lethal force, and that she will likely spend time in prison as a consequence, but perhaps less time than would normally be warranted for such a crime. Chapter 10. Aftermath. The magistrate's court convened on a grey Wednesday morning, and the small courthouse was filled to capacity with villagers who had somehow justified their presence as matters of civic duty rather than prurient interest. Miss Marple sat in the back, her knitting needles clicking with mechanical steadiness, observing the proceedings with the detached clarity of someone who had seen the machinery of justice operate many times before. Sarah Vane appeared before the magistrate, looking considerably younger than her actual age, a pale, frightened girl whose trauma was written plainly across her face. The solicitor that Reverend Vane had retained presented the case with careful skill, placing Harker's predatory correspondence before the court, establishing the pattern of harassment and threat, demonstrating that Sarah had been a vulnerable young woman under psychological siege. The defendant, the solicitor, argued, acted in a state of extreme distress, facing explicit threats to her reputation and her future. While the use of lethal force cannot be entirely condoned, the provocation was extraordinary and the defendant's mental state at the time severely compromised by fear and desperation. The magistrate listened with an expression of careful neutrality, his questions penetrating but not unkind. By the time the hearing concluded, it was clear that he viewed the case not as a straightforward murder, but as a tragic convergence of circumstances and human frailty. His judgment was delivered the following Monday. Sarah Vane would be committed to trial at the Assizes, but with a recommendation for leniency. she would remain in custody pending trial. But the magistrate's comments to the court suggested that a sentence of imprisonment, rather than transportation or execution, was the anticipated outcome. Justice, Miss Marple observed to Eleanor Vane when she encountered her at the church the following morning, is rarely as satisfying as we wish it to be. It is, instead, a complicated negotiation between law and mercy, between punishment and circumstances. Eleanor, who had aged noticeably in the weeks since the murder, nodded with the weary understanding of someone who had learned difficult truths about the nature of human suffering. "Will you remain in Ashford?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "Clarence has offered his resignation to the diocesan bishop, though the bishop has not yet accepted it. Some in the parish are calling for his removal. Others, a smaller group, but growing, are suggesting that we judge people too harshly. That Clarence's protection of Sarah was, despite its methods, rooted in something that resembles love." "And what do you believe?" Miss Marple inquired. "I believe," Eleanor said slowly, "that my husband made terrible mistakes, but mistakes born of desperation to protect someone vulnerable. I also believe that we should not have lied to the police, that Thomas Wickham should never have been arrested. I believe that many things went wrong that could have gone differently. But I also believe that condemning Clarence entirely would be to ignore the complexity of what occurred." This assessment, Miss Marple reflected, represented considerable moral growth for a woman who, a week earlier, had been consumed by anxiety and fear. The crisis had stripped away Eleanor's tendency toward emotional obfuscation and forced her toward a more honest reckoning with human complexity. Thomas Wickham left Ashford on the last Friday of June. His departure was quiet and without fanfare. Simply packed his belongings and boarded the morning train to London, where he had secured employment in a larger city where his name carried no association with scandal. His parents wept at his departure, understanding that their village had, through its hasty judgment, driven away one of its own. "The innocent," Miss Marple said to the hotel proprietor, observing Thomas's departure from the station, "often suffer more than the guilty in the aftermath of crime. The guilty at least have the clarity of knowing their actions, however reprehensible, were their own. The innocent must carry the burden of being wronged, and such burdens do not always sit lightly." The summer progressed with the slow return to normalcy that characterizes small villages. Life resumed its ordinary patterns. Gardens were tended, businesses operated, social gatherings continued. Yet something essential had shifted in the community's understanding of itself. Desmond Harker, in death, became a cautionary figure, reminder that respectability and wealth could mask predatory behavior, that a man could hide behind social position and legal authority to commit acts of harassment and coercion. Conversations that might previously have been considered inappropriate discussions of how women could protect themselves from unwanted advances. Acknowledgement of the power imbalances that made such predation possible became gradually more common. Miss Marple remained in Ashford through July, extending her hotel stay longer than she had originally planned. She spent her time in the gardens, observing the village with the careful attention that had become her habit, noting how relationships shifted and reformed in the aftermath of scandal. Robert Ashworth visited her one afternoon, bringing news from the solicitor handling Sarah's trial preparation. "She's to be tried in September," he said. "The solicitor believes the trial will likely result in a conviction, but with a lenient sentence. Perhaps 5 years imprisonment, possibly less if the judge shows mercy." And how does Sarah herself bear this knowledge? Miss Marple asked. With resignation, Robert said. She seems to have accepted that her actions have consequences, that no amount of justifiable fear entirely negates the fact that she struck a man down with lethal force. There's a maturity in her acceptance that seems premature for someone her age. But perhaps such maturity is necessary given her circumstances. It was on the last evening of July that Miss Marple found herself sitting in the church garden, her knitting abandoned in her lap, watching the light fade from the sky in shades of rose and gold. The church bells, silent for weeks, would soon ring again as life in Ashford slowly reconstituted itself. Eleanor Vane joined her on the bench, settling herself with a soft sigh. Clarence has decided to remain, Eleanor said. The bishop has accepted his request to continue as vicar, though with a period of probation and considerable restrictions on his pastoral responsibilities, while trust is rebuilt. It will be difficult. Some in the parish will never forgive him. But he has decided that running away would be a greater betrayal than remaining and attempting to rebuild what has been damaged. That suggests wisdom, Miss Marple said. Or at least the beginning of it. I have been thinking about you, Eleanor continued. About how you saw through our deceptions so quickly. How you understood what had truly occurred when we ourselves were lost in confusion and fear. How did you know? Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, watching a bird settle into the hedge across the garden. I have lived a long life in a small village, she said finally. I have observed people in their daily interactions, their habitual behaviors, their small deceptions and large truths. And I have learned that human nature follows patterns, as predictable as the seasons, though often as hidden as the roots beneath a garden. But you couldn't have known about Sarah. About what Harker did, no, Miss Marple agreed. But I knew about Eleanor Vane. I knew that you are a woman of principle, that your anxiety was not born of personal guilt, but of the knowledge of someone else's wrongdoing. I knew that you were protecting something precious to you. And I observed that your niece was troubled in ways that suggested trauma rather than mere youthful melancholy. She turned to look at Eleanor directly. People reveal themselves through small gestures, through the way they stand, the way they avoid looking directly at things. Sarah avoided looking at the bell tower. You avoided looking at your husband. These avoidances told their own story. Eleanor nodded slowly. So we were never truly hidden. Our secrets were transparent to anyone who truly looked. All secrets are, Miss Marple said gently. The question is not whether we can hide them. As she packed her belongings on her final morning in Ashford, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar privilege of her position. She was a woman to whom people confessed, whose observations were sought, whose judgment was however quietly true. She asked nothing but attention, and in return, she was given access to the hidden architecture of human behavior. It was, she reflected, a profound responsibility. But it was also, in its way, a profound gift. The end.